In a low room that smelled of warm resin, a figure with the head of a jackal leaned over a deceased man. The long black muzzle, the tall ears, the flat and unblinking stare, and to anyone who caught sight of the scene, the Lord of the Dead had come in person to ready a soul for the road ahead. But reach up, take that sleek dark head in both hands, and lift, and you'd find something far stranger underneath. A man sweating in the heat, as human as you are. That narrow gap, the one between the god and the man wearing his face, is the doorway into a question we've been getting wrong for 2,000 years. Did the ancient Egyptians truly believe that their deities had animal heads? And if they didn't, how come this idea became so ingrained? You already know the images. A man's body topped with the head of a falcon, or a jackal, or an ibis with its long curved beak. A woman with the head of a lioness, or a great cow's horns rising from her brow are other common options as well. They stare out from temple walls and coffin lids and museum cases, and they're so familiar that almost nobody stops to ask the obvious thing. Did the Egyptians actually believe this? Did they think that somewhere beyond the sky there really stood a person with a bird's head sitting on human shoulders? It sounds like a silly question, but it isn't, and the answer reaches into how an entire civilization understood the divine. The hybrid figure on the wall was never meant to be a snapshot of a god caught standing in a doorway. It was something else. And to see what, you have to stop thinking like a museum visitor and start thinking like someone who could read hieroglyphics. Here's the thing most people miss. To an ancient Egyptian, a picture and a word weren't separate categories. Their writing was made of pictures, of birds and snakes and reeds and eyes and water, and roughly a quarter of all their hieroglyphic signs were animals or parts of animals. When you live inside a framework like that, an image on a wall is closer to a sentence, and it can be read. So when a painter gave a god the head of a falcon, he wasn't claiming the god's skull was shaped like a bird's. He was writing. The falcon meant the open sky and the sudden plunging speed of a hunter dropping out of the sun. So the falcon head told you in an instant that you were looking at Horus, the sky god, and the power behind the throne. The jackal that prowled the desert edges where the cemeteries lay told you this was Anubis, who watched over the dead. The ibis that waded the floodwater and seemed to write its own tracks in the mud belonged to Thoth, the god of wisdom and writing. The head was a caption. It named the god and announced what the god was for, all in a single glance. And the choice was precise, allowing communication at an almost mimetic level. Set a lioness's head on a goddess, and you've summoned Sekhmet, a being of conflicts and various other forms of destruction, the oppressive heat of the desert given an aggressive face. Swap that lioness for a household cat, and the temperature drops completely, and now you have Bastet, a gentle guardian of the home. So the animal head worked the way a logo or a meme works for us, or the way a halo once told a churchgoer they were looking at a saint. It carried a meaning, and it was never meant to be a divine biology lesson on how the gods actually looked. And the Egyptians said as much, in their own roundabout way. Their sacred writings are surprisingly blunt, that nobody actually knew what the gods looked like. The true shape of a god was hidden in secret, beyond the reach of the living. One body of funerary spells, the coffin texts, goes so far as to suggest that only the dead, only someone who had already crossed over, could ever look on a god's real form. The living got the symbols that we're familiar with, and the gods kept their true faces to themselves. You can see the same idea in the sheer inconsistency of the pictures, which is the detail that really gives away that these demi-human creatures were just symbolic. If the Egyptians thought Hathor literally had the head of a cow, they were awfully careless about it. They also drew her as a full woman, a complete cow, a cobra, a lioness, and a woman with a cow's ears or horns cradling a sun disk. A goddess could appear as a falcon one day, and a falcon-headed woman the next, and nobody treated that as a contradiction. You can't be loose and flexible about a fact you believe is fixed, especially given the reverence with which the ancient Egyptians treated their gods. You can only shift the picture around like that if you understand, on some level, that every one of those images is a costume. It's a way of pointing at a being whose real nature was too vast to be pinned to any single shape, but whose qualities could be instantly conveyed through an animal. One of the most important gods, Set, the lord of storms and disorder, was drawn with the head of a creature nobody has ever managed to identify. It's a long-snouted beast with squared-off ears and a stiff tail that matches no living animal we know. Whether the Egyptians knew what this animal was is another historical mystery entirely. However, some historians believe that the animal was purposely unknowable, representing the disorder brought by Set. In that case, a confusing, non-existent animal may actually have communicated what Set was known for. This is where it gets really interesting, because just a symbol doesn't quite cover it either. The Egyptians believed a god could be present in an object or an animal without being trapped inside it. They had a word for the part of a being that acted on the world and could be seen, and they called it the Ba. Any visible flash of a god's power could be called its Ba, and the sun itself was reckoned the Ba of Ra. A statue, properly made and woken with ritual, could become a vessel that a god's Ba would come down and inhabit. The image wasn't the god, but the image was a house the god might choose to live in. Once you grasp that, the famous animal cults stop looking like crude superstition and start to make more sense in context. At Memphis, a single living bull, known as the Apis bull, bearing the right markings, was treated as the living image of the creator god. When it passed, it merged with Osiris and was laid to rest in the great granite sarcophagi beneath Saqqara, while priests hunted for the calf that would carry the presents forward. The statues inside the temples, meanwhile, were tended like living royalty, woken each morning, washed, dressed, and fed, then sealed back into the dark at night. None of that makes sense if the image is only a carving to the ancient Egyptian mind, but it makes perfect sense if the image is where a god has agreed to stay. The ibis did the same work for Thoth, and the Egyptians mummified these sacred birds on a scale that's hard to picture, by some estimates close to 1 million in a single catacomb. The dog catacombs of Anubis ran into the millions, and they weren't bowing to birds and dogs as such. Each animal was a lamp the divine could shine through. Which brings us back to that jackal-headed figure leaning over the corpse. There's hard archaeological reason to think priests really did pull on animal masks and step into a god's role for the length of a ritual. A ceramic jackal head has survived that was, according to some scholars, built to be worn. It's hollow, weighted to rest on a person's shoulders, with the eye holes cut not in the snout, but lower down, in the neck, so the man inside could see out while the god's face stared ahead. Picture a priest in the embalming workshop, lowering this heavy thing over his head and becoming Anubis for the family gathered to grieve. This is probably one of the threads that knotted the whole confusion together. Some specialists suspect that this kind of sacred theater, with humans masked as gods and acting out the old myths, fed back into the art itself. People watched the masked figure perform the part of the deity, and the image of a human body with an animal head took root, half ritual and half representation. The man in the mask wasn't claiming the god had a jackal's head. He was lending the god his body for a time, so that the divine could be present in a room full of mourning. If you still doubt that the animal heads were a deliberate language rather than a literal belief, look at what happened when one pharaoh rewrote the whole vocabulary. In the 14th century BC, The king we call Akhenaten swept the old gods aside and raised up a single deity, the Aten, the disk of the sun. And here's the interesting part. This new supreme monotheistic deity was given no human or animal form at all. It was shown as a plain disk in the sky, sending down long rays that ended in tiny human hands, offering life to the royal family. The older sun god had been drawn with a falcon's head, and that version was simply thrown out. That choice only makes sense if the Egyptians understood their images as arguments. Akhenaten was making a theological claim with that picture, that the divine was a pure, remote force that gave life, not a creature you might meet out in the marsh or the desert. To change the picture was to change the idea behind it, and taking away the classical animal head was a theological statement. The flexibility ran the other way, too, and the Egyptians could fuse two gods into one when their roles overlapped, stitching Amun together with Ra to make Amun-Ra. The whole thing behaves like a language being spoken, not a gallery of faces copied from what they believed the gods actually appear as. So if the Egyptians themselves treated all of this as a careful visual language, that begs the question of where our understanding of Egyptian gods as half-animal creatures came from. A good deal of it came from outsiders who didn't get the cultural frame of reference. Greek and later Roman visitors found temples full of animal-headed gods, sacred bulls pampered like princes, and cats and birds buried with honors. Many concluded the Egyptians were worshipping the animals themselves, and they pointed to the art that depicted the gods with animal heads as further proof. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BC, gave over long passages to Egyptian animal customs, fascinated and baffled in equal measure. Centuries later, the Roman satirist Juvenal sneered openly at a people who, as he saw it, bowed down before common cats and dogs. Part of what threw these visitors was timing. The animal cults didn't hold steady across 3,000 years. They swelled enormously in Egypt's later centuries, the very era when Greeks and Romans were arriving in numbers. The vast catacombs of mummified ibises, dogs, and cats mostly belonged to that late stretch. So foreigners were seeing the practice at its most extreme, with little to no access to the older theology that had always sat behind it. Even a Christian writer like Clement of Alexandria remarked that pagan Greeks never let a day pass without laughing at the Egyptians over their supposed animal worship. Though he was fair enough to add that the Greeks honored plenty of animals of their own. The mockery stuck, and it traveled, and the picture of Egypt as a land of gods who simply happened to have beasts' heads is in large part a foreign caricature. It's been repeated now for 2,500 years, and along the way most of us absorb it without ever thinking to question it. In the end, the Egyptians knew exactly what a falcon was, and exactly what a man was, and when they joined the two together, they weren't sketching a demi-human divine figure. They were writing a kind of sacred shorthand, pointing past the image toward a power they openly admitted they couldn't see. Despite what the Greeks and Romans thought, the animal head was never the god's face. It was a word for the god, a costume the divine could put on and take off. They didn't literally think their gods had the heads of animals because they fully admitted that the true form of the Egyptian gods was beyond human comprehension. So instead, they chose animals as symbols to represent those gods based upon attributes those divine figures were known for. In the early summer of 1189, a black lacquered chest was carried south out of the far north of Japan, and inside it, swimming in rice wine to slow the rot, was a man's head. It belonged to Minamoto no Yoshitsune, the most gifted battlefield commander of his generation, and it was being sent to his own brother as proof that the problem had finally been dealt with. By the time the chest reached the inspectors near Kamakura, weeks of summer travel had done their work, and the face inside could have been anyone. In that ruin, wrought by the summer heat, centuries of legend would find their opening, and many would come to believe the head in the box wasn't really his. In this version, Yoshitsune slipped the trap, vanished into the northern wilds, crossed to the Asian mainland, and reinvented himself as the most feared conqueror who ever lived. This is the theory, briefly mainstream in Japan, that Genghis Khan, the ruler of the Mongol Empire, was actually Japanese. Yoshitsune was born around 1159 into the Minamoto, one of the two great warrior clans tearing the country apart in the twilight of the Heian Age. His father picked the losing side of a palace revolt and didn't live to regret it, and his infant son was packed off to a mountain temple as a boy. He was given the name Ushiwakamaru and was expected to disappear forever, living as a monk. But he had other plans, and the legends say he trained in secret on the slopes of Kurama, where he learned how to fight from Tengu and other mountain spirits. Whatever the truth of that, he came down from the mountain a soldier rather than a monk. He found his way north to Hiraizumi and the protection of a powerful regional lord named Fujiwara no Hidehira, and there he waited. His moment came in 1180 when his older half-brother Yoritomo raised the Minamoto banners against the rival Taira clan in the conflict we now call the Genpei War. Yoshitsune rode to join him, and what followed made his name. At the Battle of Ichi no Tani in 1184, he supposedly led a cavalry charge straight down a cliff face the enemy thought impassable. He repeated these daring acts numerous times over the course of the conflict, and earned himself a reputation as a great commander who led from the front. In 1185, in the narrow straits at Dan no Ura, he shattered the Taira fleet and ended the Genpei War outright. He was hailed as a hero, and that's where the problems came for him, because winning on the battlefield turned out to be the easy part. Yoshitsune's problem was his brother, the man he commanded forces under. Yoritomo was building something no Japanese leader had managed before. He was laying the foundation of a genuine military government. He had no patience for a younger sibling who accepted honors from the imperial court without permission and behaved like a star. Brilliance on the battlefield curdled, in Yoritomo's eyes, into a direct threat to his new government. Within months of his greatest victory, Yoshitsune found himself declared an enemy of the state, hunted the length of the country by the very government his field command had built. He ran north again, back to Hiraizumi, back to the samurai family that had sheltered him as a boy. For a while it worked, but his old protector Hidehira died, and the son who inherited the domain, Fujiwara no Yasuhira, had neither his father's nerve nor his father's loyalty. With Yoritomo leaning on him hard, Yasuhira chose what he thought was self-preservation, and in 1189 his troops surrounded Yoshitsune's residence on the Kuromo River. What happened there became one of the most retold last stands in Japanese history. Yoshitsune's giant retainer, the warrior monk Benkei, is said to have held the bridge alone, while arrows turned him into a pincushion. According to legend, he died on his feet, still blocking the way long after the life had left him. Inside, with the walls closing in, Yoshitsune saw to it that his young wife and small daughter wouldn't be taken alive, and then performed the ritual of seppuku. He was about 30 years old, and he had seen one of the fastest reversals of fortune in history. Yasuhira had the head preserved in alcohol, sealed in that black lacquered chest, and sent south as a trophy, but it bought him nothing. Yasuhira, despite having done it on the orders of Yoritomo, had killed his own half-brother, and Yoritomo moved to wipe out the entire northern Fujiwara clan within months. For the Japanese people, the idea that a warrior and commander of such great ability could simply be wiped out so quickly didn't sit well. That refusal is the soil the whole legend grew in, and the circumstances of his death practically fertilized it. Here was a beloved hero brought down by a brother's jealousy rather than honest defeat, dying in a remote corner of the country with no impartial witnesses to swear to what really happened. And then there was that head, which had spent weeks rotting in wine before anyone official could examine it. This meant nobody could actually say with any degree of certainty that it belonged to the man it was supposed to. Starting a couple of centuries after his death, the narrative of his life grew a new final chapter, one where he didn't die at Koromogawa at all. The first version kept him close to home, and this version is actually more compelling because it's theoretically possible. In it, Yoshitsune escaped the siege, fled across the water to the island we now call Hokkaido, and lived out his days among the Ainu, the indigenous people of the north. Believers pointed to Ainu reverence for a Japanese hero, a figure sometimes called Okikurumi, and decided he and the vanished samurai were one and the same. Shrines went up in honor of this hero on the island, and a few still stand, but whether this is actually related to Yoshitsune or not remains unproven. For a long time, that was as far as the legend reached, a hero who'd found peace at the northern edge of the known world of medieval Japan. Then, in the comfortable centuries of the Edo period, the era when most of what we think constitutes ancient Japanese tradition solidified, something interesting happened. People began to question why such a great hero would simply stop in what were then the desolate wastes of Hokkaido. The Asian mainland was just across the water, and out on the Mongolian steppe, history happened to be cooking up the perfect candidate for a second life. The timing is what hooks people, since the great warrior, under the theory that he actually lived, vanished from the historical record in 1189. A short while later, a previously obscure figure named Temujin started welding the fractured Mongol tribes into a single force. By 1206, he was proclaimed Genghis Khan at a great gathering of powerful Mongol rulers, and he was declared to be the ruler of everything under the vast sky. A legendary samurai disappears in the north, a world conqueror appears in the west, and the gap between the two is just wide enough to fill in the rest. The first and most obvious question here should be whether there's any evidence for this historical mystery, and I'll start with what true believers actually claimed. They start with the established fact that samurai were trained primarily in archery, horsemanship, and tactics, which fits well with what they knew of the Mongols. From there, everything about the theory becomes increasingly less rooted in anything we could call accurate history. The Minamoto fought under white flags, the Taira under red, and white was the color of Yoshitsune's house. Genghis Khan, the believers noted, marched under a white standard too, which is actually historically accurate. They also claimed that at his coronation, he raised up Minamoto-style flags and even claimed descent from a people far away on an island. This part is, perhaps unsurprisingly, not attested in any sources other than secondary accounts written centuries later by believers in this historical theory. The centerpiece of the whole argument is the meaning of the word Genghis or Chinggis, which isn't known for certain. Read the characters of Yoshitsune's name in their Sino-Japanese form, and you can squeeze out something like Gengi-kei. According to true believers, this echoes the proper pronunciation of Genghis used by the Mongolians themselves. They argued that Gengi-kei, when pronounced by 13th century Mongolians, was, in essence, them trying to say the Chinese version of Yoshitsune's name. There's no real evidence to support this, but since the meaning of the title is ultimately unknown, this can't actually be proven or disproven. What can be disproven is the next claim that the believers make, and some of them tie the title Khan to the Japanese word kami, meaning a god. The problem with that is that Khan is a word, likely of Turkic origin, that has been attested in the written records since at least the 6th century AD. The title had been used by Mongols for centuries prior to Genghis Khan, and in actuality, he was proclaimed Great Khan in 1206, having already held the title Khan before that. What turned this somewhat bizarre folktale into a national obsession wasn't a Mongolian document from the Yuan Empire or an archaeological dig. It was politics, and two men in particular, who took up the idea to boost Japan's national standing in the West and at home after the Meiji Restoration in the mid-19th century. The first was a scholar named Suematsu Kenchu, who, while studying at Cambridge in 1879, introduced the idea to Westerners. He wrote an English-language thesis arguing flatly that the great conqueror and the Japanese hero were the same person. His timing wasn't innocent, since Japan had just thrown off centuries of isolation. The nation was racing to be taken seriously by Western powers, and suggesting a Japanese man had founded the largest land empire in history was useful for Victorian-era prestige. The idea really detonated in 1924 when an amateur historian named Oyabe Zenichiru, a Christian missionary and educator who'd spent years among the Ainu on Hokkaido, took it up. He published a book whose title plainly declared Genghis Khan to have been Yoshitsune. It became a runaway bestseller, and many people took it at face value, but perhaps not for the most innocent reason. Japan was deep into a national project of enriching the country and strengthening the army, with hungry eyes on Manchuria and Mongolia. Japan would, within a decade, establish a puppet state in Manchuria, though it never realized any claims on Mongolia due to Soviet protection. A narrative in which a Japanese hero had personally fathered the Mongol Empire was extraordinarily convenient for a nation preparing to march into exactly that territory. Here's where the historical mystery runs into the actual contemporary documents from the Mongols themselves. The Mongols left their own account of Genghis Khan's origins, a chronicle composed not long after his death that traces his ancestry, his birth, and his hard upbringing on the steppe. It's the biography of a Mongol boy named Temujin, born to a Mongol family, with no missing years, where a foreign samurai might be slotted in. The most widely accepted estimate puts Temujin's birth around 1162, which makes him roughly the same age. However, aside from that historical coincidence, the dates are much worse for the theory than the believers let on. By 1186, 3 full years before Yoshitsune supposedly died at Koromogawa, Temujin already had children of his own out on the steppe, including the son who'd one day inherit the empire. Perhaps I'm stating the obvious here, but a man can't have founded a dynasty on the steppe while still living in northern Japan. After 1945, with the Japanese Empire in ruins, the theory lost its grip, partly because the appetite for nationalist myth-making had soured, but it was also partly out of a recognition that telling the Mongolian people their founding hero was secretly a Japanese castaway was, at best, an insult. It would almost be like Romanians claiming that George Washington was secretly a Wallachian prince who fled the Ottoman Turks to establish the United States. To say that such a belief would cause some unnecessary diplomatic tensions may be an understatement. Yet despite every legitimate Japanese historian now accepting that this theory has no basis in reality, the legend never fully went away, with the internet giving it some new life. It still occasionally surfaces because in the end it was never really a claim about Mongolia at all. It was about a country that loved a national hero too much to accept that he almost certainly met a brutal end at the hands of his own brother. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy with my usual reminder to hit the notification bell and the subscribe button. Also, don't forget to leave a comment telling me what topics you'd like covered in the future, or just drop a quick "I'm doing my part." Pull up almost any European world map drawn between the 1500s and the 1800s, and you'll find a country sitting across the top of Asia that seems distinctly out of place. It's labeled Tartary, or sometimes Great Tartary, and on the older maps it's enormous, a single name sprawled from the edge of Eastern Europe across all of Siberia. From there it travels down toward the borders of China and India, and to a modern eye it looks like proof of something. Here's a vast nation, printed confidently by the best mapmakers of their day, and then it's gone. No textbook talks about it, and no museum displays anything from this supposed state, at least not under the name Great Tartary. That question has launched one of the strangest history theories on the internet, and according to its believers, Tartary wasn't just a placeholder name on a map. It was a lost empire, a technologically advanced, globe-spanning civilization that built the world's most beautiful architecture before being wiped from memory in a deliberate cover-up. The truth is stranger and, in its own way, far more interesting because Tartary was real. It just wasn't anything like what these theorists imagine. To comprehend why the maps were labeled as Great Tartary, you have to start with a word, and the word starts with terror. In the early 1200s, the armies of Genghis Khan came out of the eastern steppe and tore into the settled world with a speed that nobody in Europe or the Middle East could quite process. The Chinese, the other victims of this invasion, were far more familiar with recent incursions of steppe nomads into their land, but even Chinese historians were shocked by the Mongols. The people doing the conquering went by various names, but one group the Mongols had absorbed were known as the Tatars. That's the name that stuck to all of them in the Western imagination, with one small variant. When word of these horsemen reached Latin Christendom, frightened chroniclers and clergy didn't simply write down Tatar. They added an extra letter, turning Tatar into Tartar, and that small change carried significant weight in their minds. Tartarus, in classical Greek and Roman myth, was the pit beneath the underworld, the deepest dungeon reserved for the damned. So the invaders effectively became people from hell, and the linguistic similarity between the word Tatar and Tartarus played a major role. A French king of the era is said to have leaned into the grim pun, suggesting the Tartars ought to be shoved back down into Tartarus. So before Tartary was ever a place on a map, it was an insult soaked in fear of the Mongols and their allies. It didn't describe a nation or a single people with any precision, and it was never meant to. It was a catch-all that Europeans slapped onto the huge, half-unknown interior of Asia and everyone who came galloping out of it. Travelers like Marco Polo wrote of Tartars, and so did diplomats, traders, and missionaries, applying the same word to virtually any steppe peoples. But that's exactly what makes it so confusing, since, of course, there really were a people who called themselves Tatars. They were, and still are, distinct peoples with their own languages and history, and groups like the Crimean Tatars built real, organized states of their own. So the word always had a thread of something true running through it, which is precisely what makes it such fertile ground for a myth. For the next few centuries, Great Tartary was depicted on virtually all maps that depicted the world. When the great Flemish cartographer Abraham Ortelius published his landmark atlas in 1570, it included a map of Tartary subtitled as "The Realm of the Great Khan." It covered an enormous portion of the globe, Eastern Europe's fringe, the whole Siberian north, and a generous slice of what's now China. But here's the thing you have to understand about that map, because it wasn't drawn from knowledge. It was drawn from the lack of it. European geographers in 1570 had almost no reliable information about the interior of Asia. They knew the coastlines, they knew the trade route cities, and past that they had rumor, travelers' tales, and a great deal of blank parchment. Tartary was the word they used to fill the blank, because they knew that's where the Mongols and their allies came from. As real exploration crept inland over the next 200 years, the single Tartary began to fracture. Mapmakers started carving it into pieces with modifiers attached. There was Chinese Tartary, covering Manchuria, Mongolia, and Tibet under the Qing dynasty. There was Russian or Muscovite Tartary, meaning Siberia, and the lands the czars were steadily swallowing. And then there was independent Tartary, the Central Asians, composed of people like the Kazakhs, that hadn't yet been absorbed by anyone. These weren't a unified state answering to one throne by any means, and the creators of the maps understood that, as did the people of the time. They were different peoples under different rulers, grouped beneath one tired old label out of sheer habit. The believers loved to point at one document in particular, the first edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, printed in 1771. This entry described Tartary as a vast country in the north of Asia, inhabited by a variety of Turco-Mongolian people. To them, that settles the matter, because a respected reference book called it a country. But read it the way its own authors meant it, and country there means a region, a stretch of land, the way you'd talk about Texas Hill Country or wine country. That same edition freely admitted how little Europeans actually knew about the place. It wasn't certifying an empire, but rather, it was describing a frontier nobody in the West had properly surveyed. The reason for that splintering of Tartary over time was simple, because Europeans were finally getting real data on what actually existed there. As the Russian Empire pushed its way across Siberia and the Qing dynasty consolidated its grip on the eastern steppe, the blank parchment started filling in. The more anyone learned about the place, the less sense it made to keep pretending it was one thing. By the 1800s, as ethnographers and imperial surveyors finally mapped the region in detail, the word Tartary simply dissolved into better named places. They were now words we're now familiar with, like Siberia, Mongolia, Turkestan, and Manchuria, and Tartary retired into the drawers of antique map dealers. There was no cover-up, of course. There was only cartography catching up with the reality of the situation on the ground. So how does a retired map label become a bizarre theory about a suppressed super-civilization? That part has a surprisingly specific origin story. The seed was planted in the Soviet Union, and it grew from there to where it stands today. Starting in the 1970s and 80s, a mathematician named Anatoly Fomenko began promoting something he called the New Chronology. This was an elaborate claim that essentially all of recorded history is a fabrication, that the ancient and medieval past was either invented or wildly miscounted. Under this theory, the true timeline is far shorter than we think, and specifically designed to cover up the true glory of Russia. It's nonsense by every standard of actual evidence, but it's ambitious nonsense, and it found an audience. From there, a Russian writer named Nikolai Levashov fused those ideas with more nationalist mythology. He recast Great Tartaria as a glorious lost Slavic empire that had been erased by enemies of the Russian people. The name itself was just one more form of erasure of the glory of the Russians, a sort of humiliation ritual. In its original form, this was a fantasy, a narrative about stolen national greatness, and without the internet, that's where it likely would have stopped. Then, around 2016, the idea jumped languages and platforms. On Reddit, YouTube, and other corners of the English-speaking internet, Tartaria got stripped of its Russian nationalist baggage and rebuilt into something looser and more global. In this new version, Tartaria wasn't merely Russian, and it wasn't just confined to the steppes. It was everywhere. It became a worldwide empire of staggering sophistication that had supposedly raised the planet's grandest buildings, from cathedrals to capitol domes. Then just over a century ago, Great Tartaria was scrubbed from the history books, for reasons that aren't entirely coherent. Part of the appeal was obvious from the start, and it looked to the great architecture produced in centuries prior. The theory flattered anyone who'd ever looked up at an ornate old train station, then over at a bland modern one, and wondered whether we'd lost something important along the way. Believers point to the ornate, palatial structures thrown up for the great world's fairs, like the Panama Pacific International Exposition in San Francisco in 1915. They also point to Chicago's dazzling white city of 1893, and they argue that no society of that era could possibly have built something so beautiful so quickly, only to tear it down again. Surely, they reason, these were salvaged Tartarian buildings, photographed for posterity, and then demolished to bury the evidence. The same suspicion gets pointed at other demolished landmarks as well, not just temporary buildings put up for world fairs. The original Pennsylvania station in New York, a soaring temple of glass and steel, was knocked down in the 1960s. Then there's the so-called mud flood, which is how I heard about this bizarre historical theory to begin with. Across plenty of old cities, you can find buildings whose windows or doorways now sit oddly below street level, half swallowed by the ground. To a believer, that's proof of a continent-burying cataclysm of mud that drowned the old empire and reset civilization from scratch. The same logic gets applied to star-shaped forts, those geometric stone fortifications found all over Europe. The theory reimagines star forts as power plants, antennas for harvesting energy straight out of the atmosphere. Even the apparent abundance of orphans in the 1800s gets folded in, explained away as young people rounded up after the world had been wiped clean. The trouble is that every one of those quote-unquote clues has a fully documented answer. Those star forts were developed in Italy beginning in the mid-1400s for one very specific reason, which was cannons. Tall medieval castle walls shattered under cannon fire, so engineers built low, angled, star-pointed ramparts that deflected cannonballs and let defenders volley back with overlapping fire. They look mysterious only if you don't know what artillery did to medieval architecture. For 3 centuries, these forts got bigger, and they were simply the smartest way to survive a siege. The doorways and windows have an answer too, and it's one that cities are rather proud of. Chicago in the 1850s literally jacked its streets up by several feet to install a sewer system and drain its swampy ground, leaving old ground floors stranded below the new roadway. This means that in certain areas, old buildings appear as though they are partly submerged. Seattle did much the same after its Great Fire, regrading whole blocks a full story higher to build out sewers. Other buildings have similar partly submerged appearances because, over the centuries, the buildings have gradually subsided into the land they were built on. The massive temporary buildings of the 19th and early 20th century are one of the favorite arguments of Great Tartaria theorists. Those seemingly impossible World's Fair exposition buildings were never built to last more than a single year. The gleaming white palaces of Chicago's fair were steel-framed sheds dressed in something called staff, a cheap mixture that could be poured into molds. They dried fast and were painted to mimic marble, and it was, essentially, stage scenery at massive architectural scale. The whole white city in Chicago stood for barely 6 months, and within a year of the fair closing, most of it had been pulled down or lost to fire. As for the general grandeur of 19th century buildings, their architects had trained in the neoclassical manner, the height of fashion at the time. The orphans have a paper trail as well, and they come from a time when mortality rates were exceedingly high. What seems now to be an unusual amount of orphans is actually just what happens when families were huge, and both parents could easily end up 6 feet under due to cholera or tuberculosis. Of course, this theory of a grand world-spanning empire also completely lacks any documentary evidence whatsoever. No person living through the time ever wrote about it, which is a problem in a society where people were literate, and we have their writings. In the end, Tartary was a real label for a real part of the world, and the Tatars are a real people who still live in Russia and Central Asia to this day. The closest thing to a great Tartarian empire to ever exist was the Mongol Empire, which, as we know, wasn't some sort of high-tech lost empire. And just as a quick footnote, this is perhaps one of the oddest historical mysteries I've ever covered. The idea that a placeholder name on a map ended up inspiring a bizarre internet theory centuries later is something so remote and weird that no one could have ever predicted it. And yet, for some reason, there's still multiple active subreddits promoting this pseudo-historical rabbit hole. Picture a global superpower at the height of its reach, a monarchy whose territory stretched across 4 continents. It was the first empire on which the sun never set, and its reputation for conquest is amongst the most brutal history has produced. But this empire, at one point, paused to ask a few thousand villagers on the far side of the planet a strange question. Did they want to be ruled by the crown of Spain? And if the answer came back no, the crown was supposedly prepared to pack up and leave. That's the premise behind one of the oddest episodes in colonial history, a series of consultations carried out across the Spanish Philippines in 1599. By the time these consultations happened, Spain had been in the islands for more than 30 years. Miguel López de Legazpi's expedition had landed in 1565. Manila fell under Spanish control by 1571, and the usual machinery of empire followed close behind. There were tribute demands, forced labor, encomiendas handed out to soldiers, and a steady stream of friars to convert the local populace. On paper, it looked like every other conquest of the age, but something unusual was brewing back in Spain, in the lecture halls of its universities. A generation of theologians and jurists, the thinkers we now group under the School of Salamanca, had been picking apart the moral foundation of the whole colonial project. Francisco de Vitoria argued that the indigenous peoples of newly encountered lands were the true and rightful owners of their territory. He believed they were fully capable of governing themselves, regardless of whether they were Christian or how the Spanish rated their level of civilization. Bartolomé de las Casas had spent decades hammering the same point about the problems in the Americas. Out of all this came a genuinely radical idea for the period. A king couldn't simply seize a people and declare them subjects. Legitimate rule needed some form of consent by the populations that were taken over. It was a sharp break from the old habit carried over from the Americas, where Spanish parties had read out a formal demand of submission. That process, known as requerimiento, involved conquistadors reading declarations to listeners who didn't speak a word of Spanish, then treated their silence as a yes. The idea that colonial subjects needed some buy-in to the empire sailed to Manila in the person of Domingo de Salazar. He was a Dominican who became the city's first bishop and arrived in 1581 already steeped in the Las Casas tradition. Salazar was hearing reports, often from Filipinos directly, about how badly they were being treated by Spanish officials and soldiers, and he was appalled. In 1582, he convened a synod in Manila, a gathering of clergy and learned men, to work out what the church should actually do about it. The assembly asked, in effect, whether the King of Spain had any just title to rule these islands at all. If he didn't, then every tribute collected and every order given rested on nothing but brute force. That's an extraordinary question for a colonial church to put to its own crown, and the men asking it weren't fringe troublemakers. They were the senior religious authorities of the colony. Salazar pushed the cause so hard that in his final years, he sailed all the way back to Spain to argue it at court in person, and he died in Madrid in 1594, before he could see where any of it led. Word of this traveled back to Madrid, and the crown took it seriously, partly because Philip II had already been steering Spanish expansion in a more cautious direction. Years earlier, he'd issued ordinances that quietly retired the word conquest in favor of pacification, at least in official language. So when the pressure from the Spanish Philippine clergy reached him, the answer wasn't the expected brush-off. On the 8th of February, 1597, Philip II issued a royal decree addressed to the governor of the Philippines. It ordered him to make sure the tribute laws were obeyed, to see that Filipinos were repaid for taxes wrongly taken, and, most striking of all, to obtain their free submission to the crown. The document framed it as the people freely giving themselves over to the king. Read with modern eyes, the implication is bold. If that free submission wasn't given, then Spain had no claim to be there at all. The decree reached Manila on the 5th of August, 1598, and landed on the desk of Governor Francisco de Tello, who'd taken charge of the colony 2 years earlier. He set about organizing the thing province by province. Instructions went out to the alcaldes, the local Spanish administrators, and to the religious orders working in each district. The people doing the answering were, in practice, the chiefs and leading men who'd run Filipino society long before the Spanish turned up, and who now spoke for their towns. Under Spanish rule, these individuals had held on to a slice of local authority, collecting tribute and managing their communities as a junior layer of the colonial order. This made them the obvious people to register a yes to submission to the Spanish crown, since they were beneficiaries of the system. What survives of Tello's own reporting gives a real sense of how the entire referendum process unfolded. In some areas, such as around Manila, where the Spanish presence was strongest, answers came in agreeing to submission to the crown very rapidly. However, in more far-flung territories, many of the headmen of the villages asked the colonial authorities for more time to think about it. These villagers were given as much as a year to mull it over and decide whether they wanted to be part of Spain or not. It's worth being frank about what this was and wasn't, since nobody walked into these towns handing out secret ballots. The question was put by the same colonial and religious authorities who held all the power to a local elite that had every practical reason to say yes. This was also done in a setting where a flat refusal was hard to picture actually being honored. Further, there may have been the implicit threat that a village leader who didn't want to be part of the crown would be replaced with one who did. There's also the matter of who was reporting the votes, with many of the people doing it being agents of powerful Spanish nobles on the islands. I find it hard to believe that these people would have been incentivized in any way to accurately report the voting. Further, others who were reporting the votes and explaining what the vote actually was came from the church. I suspect that while they may have not had the same economic incentive, they wanted to promote the idea that the people governed were willingly part of the crown of Spain. The recorded results, to the extent they exist, came back positive in favor of Spain absolutely everywhere, which I suppose should come as no surprise. And here's the part that gives the whole affair its peculiar, unfinished quality. The man who set it in motion was already gone. Philip II had passed on the 13th of September, 1598, barely 40 days after his decree was published in Manila. The news traveled so slowly that nobody in the islands knew it until the middle of 1599, with the consultations already underway. They were, at the end of the day, carrying out the will of a king who no longer existed, for a crown, as we will see, that no longer cared. Tello wrote up the results and sent them to the crown in a letter in July of 1599, describing the provinces that had submitted and the ones still asking for time. That letter never got its answer, and the counting stayed incomplete. The question of the holdout provinces hung in the air, and it would stay that way forever. Under the new king, Philip III, the Spanish crown simply moved along to other concerns. The grand consultation about whether Spain had the right to be in the Philippines faded out without a verdict, its loose ends never tied off. Spain, of course, stayed, and it would govern the islands for nearly 3 more centuries, despite the voting never being finished. Whether the results of the referendum would have been honored if it came back in the negative remains a historical unsolved mystery. Personally, though, I think the voter base says it all, because everyone who had the right to vote had, by this point, become dependent on the Spanish crown for their own power and authority. In general, people don't vote to give up their own power, and I'm sure more than a few headmen simply thought the entire exercise was a trick to root out disloyal elements. Sometime around the middle of the 5th century BC, a Greek traveler walked into a building so enormous he swore it outdid the pyramids. His guides led him through court after court until they reached a set of doors they wouldn't open. Behind those doors, they said, were 1,500 rooms sunk into the ground, holding the bodies of the kings who'd built the place, along with the sacred crocodiles. He was welcome to wander the upper floor, but the lower one wasn't for non-Egyptians. He recorded what he'd seen, sailed home, and for the next 24 centuries hardly anyone could even agree on where the thing had stood. The man, as you may have guessed, was Herodotus, and the building was the Egyptian labyrinth, and it may be the single most astonishing structure the ancient world managed to lose. To find what remains of it, you have to go to the Fayum, a green depression southwest of modern Cairo, where a great lake the Greeks called Moeris once spread across the desert. This was a favorite region of the 12th dynasty, and around 1800 BC it belonged to a pharaoh named Amenemhat III. Amenemhat ruled for more than 4 decades, long enough to build some impressive monuments to his reign. He built a pyramid at Hawara out of mud brick faced with limestone, and just south of it, he raised something stranger and far larger. The Egyptians knew the wider region for its devotion to Sobek, the crocodile god, and the marshes around the lake were thick with the real animals. The lake wasn't entirely natural either, and ancient writers believed the pharaohs had shaped it into a reservoir for the Nile's floodwater. The nearby capital was so bound to the animal that the Greeks simply called it the City of Crocodiles, where priests kept a jewel-wearing crocodile and fed it by hand. That push for monumental immortality showed up elsewhere in the Fayum too, where Amenemhat set a pair of colossal seated statues of himself on tall bases out near the water. We don't really know what the complex was for, and the best guess is that it did several jobs at once. It was probably a mortuary temple tied to the pharaoh's burial, and also a sort of national gathering place where the administrative districts of Egypt sent their priests to perform rites. Amenemhat's daughter, Sobekneferu, who'd later become Egypt's first confirmed female pharaoh, seems to have added her own decorations to it. By the time Greek writers arrived, the building already had a reputation, and Herodotus gave it its most famous description, as was the style at the time. He said it held 12 roofed courts, their gateways facing one another, 6 opening north and 6 opening south, all wrapped inside a single outer wall. The number of rooms is where it stops sounding like architecture and appears, at least at first glance, to be your typical Herodotus exaggeration. He counted 3,000 chambers, 1,500 above ground, and 1,500 below. He insisted the upper rooms were such a tangle that walking through them left him struggling to put it into words. The underground half he never saw, since the caretakers guarded it as a sacred space forbidden to outsiders. He added that a pyramid stood at one corner, around 240 feet tall and carved with enormous figures, reached by a passage that ran beneath the earth. Later visitors added their own layers, or perhaps I should say chambers given the topic. Writing a few centuries on, the geographer Strabo called it a giant palace made up of interior palaces, which creates a very vivid mental image in and of itself. He explained that there were 12 courts, and they were meeting halls, where priests from districts of Egypt assembled by rank. He was struck that the courts were roofed with single slabs of stone, and that the passages twisted so thoroughly a stranger couldn't navigate them alone. He named the king buried beside it as Amandaz, and described an adjoining tomb shaped like a pyramid. Diodorus Siculus, working around the same era, credited the place to a ruler he called Mendes, and said its real marvel wasn't its size, but its design. He claimed that anyone who went in couldn't find the way out without a guide who knew the building intimately. He's also the one who passed along the idea that this Egyptian maze inspired the craftsman Daedalus to build the famous labyrinth of Crete. Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century AD, claimed it had stood for thousands of years and was so solidly made of stone that time itself couldn't bring it down. He described columns cut from costly marble and harder granite, and repeated a popular ancient notion that the whole thing had once been a temple to the sun. He recorded a competing tradition that a dozen kings had built it together, the last of them a ruler named Psammaticus. These accounts don't line up, and some of the men describing the labyrinth almost certainly never set foot in it, and a few of their details fit Greek temples better than Egyptian ones. The building was already decaying as they wrote, and each writer seems to have patched the gaps with hearsay from generations earlier. One of the last classical mentions has the Roman Emperor Septimius Severus stopping by around 200 AD, and after that the record goes quiet. Unfortunately, though, what this emperor saw, exactly, is lost to history, and some historians dispute whether it actually happened. The source, the Historia Augusta, a compilation made in the 3rd century, only tells us that he visited the labyrinth and studied it carefully. This source is known for being unreliable and being more concerned with interesting narratives rather than actual history, more so than usual even for ancient sources. That said, it indicates that the labyrinth of Egypt was still well known in the Greco-Roman world, even by the 3rd century. A structure that massive doesn't simply vanish on its own, so the obvious question is how it managed to leave almost no trace, and the answer is both slow and unglamorous. Somewhere in antiquity, the labyrinth was taken apart, and by the time Roman rule ended, the ruins had already become a convenient quarry. The cut stone was hauled off to be used elsewhere until there was little left to mark the spot, and the location slipped out of memory entirely. The land itself then turned against what remained, and at some point before the mid-13th century, a canal was dug straight through the middle of where the labyrinth had stood. In the early 20th century, a newer canal was built over the old one, churning the ground a second time. The hunt to pin down the actual location is its own interesting narrative, and I think it's worth relating here, at least briefly. In the early 18th century, a French Jesuit named Claude Sicard, who spent years mapping the ruins of Egypt, argued that the labyrinth had stood at Hawara. In 1843, the Prussian scholar Carl Richard Lepsius dug around Amenemhat's pyramid, found a spread of brick chambers, and announced he'd located it. The claim was taken seriously at the time, but it wouldn't survive the next visitor, a man by the name of Flinders Petrie. When the British archaeologist examined those same brick chambers in 1888, he concluded Lepsius had been fooled in a big way. The chambers were the remains of a Greco-Roman town that had been built on top of the labyrinth long after it fell. The real building was underneath, and most of it was gone. What Petrie found instead of walls was a vast bed of stone chips, the crushed leftovers of a monument that had been smashed and carted away. From the footprint he could still trace, the complex had covered something like 28,000 square meters. It had an outer wall running roughly 385 meters by 158. He turned up fragments that hinted at the old grandeur, including statues connected to Sobek and the goddess Hathor, plus 2 granite shrines that had held images of Amenemhat himself. He even pulled scraps of papyrus carrying lines from Homer's Iliad, indicating that the site had been used during the Ptolemaic period. Petrie also cracked open the pyramid itself, and what he found inside was a feat of paranoid engineering. The burial chamber had been hollowed from a single colossal block of hard quartzite and sealed under a sliding stone roof designed to defeat robbers who'd reached it anyway. Unfortunately, his money ran out before he could go further, and after Petrie, large-scale digging at the site essentially stopped. For most of the 20th century, that was the ending. The labyrinth was a flattened field of debris, interesting to specialists and almost nobody else. Then, in 2008, a team tried a different approach. An expedition brought together Egyptian geophysicists and researchers connected to Ghent University in Belgium. They went over the ground south of the pyramid with instruments rather than shovels, using ground-penetrating radar and electrical resistivity surveys. Beneath the sand, they said, lay a grid of vertical walls forming what looked like closed chambers, sitting somewhere around 8 to 12 meters down. The readings suggested those walls were several meters thick, the kind of mass you'd expect from something built to outlast absolutely everything around it. If they were right, the labyrinth hadn't been ground entirely to dust after all. But if you were expecting me to say there would be a bigger expedition, think again. Then the story took its strangest turn, at least in my view, though I know many in my audience will find this par for the course given who was involved on the Egyptian side. After the results were presented in Belgium, Egypt's Antiquities Authority, led at the time by Zahi Hawass, reportedly clamped down on the project and discouraged further publicity. Because of this strange and controversial intervention, the larger excavation the team hoped for never happened. So the situation today is almost exactly the one Herodotus described, only inverted by time. The upper floor he was allowed to see is the part that's gone, quarried away and buried under later canals. The underground half he was forbidden to enter is the part that may still be down there, sealed now not by priests, but by the highly unusual decisions of the people who control the digging. 25 centuries later, I suppose not much has changed, and we still can't really know what truly remains in the lower part of the lost labyrinth of Egypt. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy with my usual reminder to hit the notification bell and the subscribe button. Also, don't forget to leave a comment saying what you've learned from this video or what you like to do while you watch or listen. To see the most famous light bulb in ancient Egypt, you have to crawl beneath a temple floor by the glow of a modern one. The way in is a slot cut through the paving stones of the Temple of Hathor at Dendera, barely wide enough for an adult to squeeze through. Drop down, shuffle along a corridor about chest height, and you'll come face to face with a carving that's launched 1,000 documentaries. It's an enormous tapering bulb with a serpent suspended inside it like a filament, a cable trailing from its narrow end, and a socket shaped like a flower. It was cut into this wall nearly 19 centuries before Thomas Edison was born. Some believe that this is proof that the ancient Egyptians had access to much more advanced technology than we generally believe. Dendera sits on the west bank of the Nile, roughly 60 kilometers north of Luxor, across the river from the modern city of Kina. The ancient Egyptians called the town Unet, and the ancient Greeks knew it as Tentira. People had worshipped here for thousands of years, but the building that survives today is remarkably young by Egyptian standards. Construction of the present Temple of Hathor began in 54 BC under Ptolemy XII, the father of Cleopatra VII. The decoration carried on through Cleopatra's reign and into the Roman period, when the Emperor Tiberius added the Great Hypostyle Hall. It's among the last great monumental temples of pharaonic civilization, raised when Egypt's religion was already ancient beyond reckoning, and it's also one of the best preserved. Hathor was the goddess of love, music, and motherhood, and her temple was an extremely wealthy one, befitting such a beloved goddess. To protect its treasures, the builders honeycombed the structure with narrow hidden crypts, tucked inside the thickness of the walls and beneath the floors. A dozen or so of these chambers riddle the building, and some were carved and decorated under Ptolemy XII's direction. They held the temple's most precious cult objects, including statues of the gods made of gold and gemstones. The statues themselves vanished long ago, melted down or carried off to distant lands. What survives is something arguably more interesting. Carved on the crypt walls, a detailed pictorial inventory of what was once stored inside. The famous scenes show three similar but distinct objects, and each was carved twice. One set sits in a subterranean chamber that Egyptologists label South Crypt 1C, though most visitors know it simply as Crypt 4. The matching set appears in a side chamber on the ground floor called Room G, with further versions on an upper level and in the sanctuary of a neighboring temple. In 6 of these depictions, the central image is enclosed within a great oval envelope, and that envelope is what turned a piece of temple decoration into an internet phenomenon. Inside each oval, a snake stretches at full length, rising out of an open lotus blossom. The flower's long stem trails away and connects to a small altar or stand, looking for all the world like a cord running to a power source. In the most celebrated panel, a jed pillar, that column-shaped emblem of stability, sprouts human arms that reach up and cradle the serpent's body. Kneeling figures support the scene. The god Hay, the personification of endlessness, helps hold the bubble aloft. A baboon-like creature with the face of a toad stands guard before it, gripping what appears to be a short blade. Seen with modern eyes, the resemblance to a glass bulb, filament, cable, and insulator is uncanny, and it would be somewhat dishonest to pretend otherwise. The electric idea is older than you'd think, or at least it was for me. In his 1894 book, The Dawn of Astronomy, the British astronomer Norman Lockyer mentioned a colleague's half-joking suggestion. Electric lamps would neatly explain why the painted ceilings of certain tombs weren't blackened by lamp smoke. Lockyer himself favored a duller answer involving mirrors relaying sunlight, and the joke lay dormant for the better part of a century. The modern theory was born in Vienna around 1980, when the Austrian writer Reinhard Habeck began publishing pieces on electricity in antiquity in a publication called Ancient Skies. This was the newsletter of the Ancient Astronaut Society, which promoted the idea that ancient civilizations were influenced by extraterrestrial visitors. In 1989, perhaps the most famous advocate of this theory, Erich von Däniken, had meanwhile carried the idea to a worldwide audience in one of his books. Supporters of the theory propose that the oval is a glass envelope and the snake is the filament, or the arc of a gas discharge. The lotus is the socket, the stem is the cable, and the jed pillar holding it up is a high-voltage insulator. Even the blade-wielding baboon became a danger sign warning the uninitiated away, and they argued that this would have been understood as a warning symbol. Proponents added the famous soot argument, claiming tombs and crypts show no trace of smoke. They also pointed to a temple inscription describing tall masts, sheathed in copper, erected to break storms coming from the sky, which they interpreted as lightning conductors. When pressed on where the power came from, believers tend to reach for the so-called Baghdad battery. This is a highly controversial clay jar from Mesopotamia containing a copper cylinder and an iron rod, and its identification as a battery is itself extremely heavily disputed. Here's the problem about the bulb theory. It asks you to look at the pictures and ignore the writing wrapped around them. The reliefs are surrounded by hieroglyphic captions, and the texts identify the serpent by name. He is Harsamtis, meaning Horus the Uniter of the Two Lands, a creator god and child of Hathor, who rises from the lotus flower as a living soul aboard the barge of the sun. The oval is a container called the Hin, which may represent the womb of the sky goddess, and the Jed pillar is described as carrying the god's body. Each caption closes like a ledger entry, recording the material and dimensions of the object shown. One is listed as gold and metal, 4 palms high, which is about 30 centimeters, and other listings are like this as well. These aren't schematics, as advocates claimed. They're inventory records of the cult statues once stored in these rooms. The crypts were treated as an analog of the Duat, the Egyptian underworld, and the statues rested down there. At certain festivals, priests carried them to the temple roof, so the first rays of the rising sun could touch and revive them. The genuine irony is that the scenes really are about light, the sunlight of creation's first morning, breaking from a lotus on the primeval waters. Skeptical archaeologists also raise an evidentiary problem the theory has never answered. Egypt is among the most intensively excavated landscapes on Earth, and it has produced no glass envelopes, no filaments, no sockets, and nothing capable of generating current. What it has produced, in their thousands, are simple pottery oil lamps and linen wicks. Administrative records from Deir el-Medina, the village that housed the men who cut the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings, are telling. They show officials carefully tracking the lamp wicks issued for underground work, with a designated guardian responsible for the supply. The soot premise collapses on inspection too, and the ceiling of Dendera's own hypostyle hall was caked black with the smoke of millennia. Egyptian wicks were reportedly treated with salt, which sharply reduces smoke, and polished mirrors can relay sunlight deep underground without any flame. The iconography tells the same story. Serpents rising from lotus flowers appear throughout Egyptian art, at Dendera and far beyond, without any surrounding oval. The image only becomes a bulb in the handful of panels where the womb of the sky goddess encloses it. In the end, the idea that these images represent light bulbs is fascinating, but the likely reality is no less interesting.